Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to be here with you, and thank you all for registering and joining us today for this webinar on COVID-19 and global hunger. The question that we're asking today is, how will COVID-19 affect world hunger? And I am just feeling very thankful today for technology that allows us to come into your homes as we all stay home in order to save lives. And thankful to have a wonderful panel ready to speak to this question that we will be looking at today. So to start off, I'll just give you a brief overview of what you can expect. We will first be hearing from the Executive Director of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, Jim Cornelius, sorry. We have a James Cornelius on staff. And then we'll have an update from Nadia Curry, who is the Executive Director of Tahadi, Lebanon. Very pleased to also have Lilian Zheke, our Agricultural and Livelihoods Technical Advisor for Southern Africa of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, followed by a session of question and answers. And as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that I haven't introduced myself. My name is Musu Taylor-Lewis, and I am the Director of Resources and Public Engagement at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, and very pleased to be hosting this conversation today. With that, I would just like to give you a little tour of Zoom so that you will have an opportunity during the question and answer to interact with Jim, with Nadia, and with Lillian. You'll see a question and answer feature at the bottom of your window. This allows you to type in questions you may have for Jim or for either of the guest panelists. Please take a minute right now to look for that button and feel free to ask questions once we begin. Given the number of attendees, we have over 250 people registered for this webinar today, that we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we're going to try to answer as many as possible, either using the question and answer box, which will be to your right, or verbally as time permits. And so I will be reading out some questions and directing them to Jim, Lillian, or Nadia today. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jim. Thank you so much and welcome. Looking forward to this conversation. Jim?
Well, thank you, Musu, and greetings to all those that are tuning in. Glad to have you with us. I want to share some thoughts on COVID-19 pandemic and how we're responding. It soon became clear to us that this novel coronavirus was leading to a global pandemic. We began asking the following questions. How will it affect world hunger? How will it affect our programming and fundraising? And what should we be doing in response? And I'll try to provide some answers to these questions. So first, how will COVID-19 affect world hunger? The answer to this question became clear very quickly. This global health crisis is quickly turning into a global food crisis. As governments around the world began to issue stay-at-home orders, shut down large parts of their economies to contain the spread of the virus, millions of people began losing their jobs and livelihoods literally overnight. Some food supply chains are also beginning to be disrupted, and the risks of food production are beginning to appear. In many countries around the world, millions of poor families depend on work in the informal economy as day laborers, petty traders, selling services of various kinds. They have little to no savings. What they have earned in the last day or two is what feeds their families. We've been hearing and reading reports about how these sources of income have dried up almost overnight for millions of families. I was speaking to my sister the other night, who runs a program in one of the slums of Nairobi. She told me how within days of the government of Kenya ordering a lockdown, highly vulnerable families that they work with were quickly starting to panic about where they were going to get food to feed their families in the days ahead, as they had no way to earn an income. And this issue is happening all around the world. In a major report released just this week, it's estimated that prior to the pandemic, there were about 135 million people facing acute food insecurity in 55 countries. They were at risk of facing extreme hunger and starvation unless direct assistance would be provided. The World Food Program is estimating that this number will now double in the coming months. Earlier this week, the executive director of the World Food Program, in a briefing to the United Nations Security Council, warned that we could begin to see starvation if urgent action is not taken. Like in Canada, many governments are scrambling to find ways to get immediate assistance to households in need of help. However, many countries don't have the funding or the systems in place to effectively deliver this assistance quickly to everyone in need. Most households newly in distress are not receiving assistance at this time. There's also growing concerns that food supply chains will be seriously disrupted, reducing the availability of food and dramatically increasing prices, causing hunger for the poorest families. We have already begun to see some disruptions. It's vital that systems for transporting, processing, distributing, and selling food continues to function. Like in Canada, governments are working to keep these food supply chains moving, deeming these activities an essential service. Many countries are dependent on food imports. To ensure these countries can continue to get the food supplies they need, exporting countries are being urged not to put export restrictions or bans on the supply of food across borders. However, there will be pressure on national governments to keep food in their own countries and to stop exports, presenting some real risk for those food importing countries. There are also some risks that farmers will not be able to secure the inputs or the labor they need to plant, manage, and harvest their crops, leading to food shortages down the road. Again, governments are working to keep the input and marketing supply chains moving and labor required available. Nevertheless, strains on these systems are emerging to threatening future food production and supply in various parts of the world. So how is the Foodgrains Bank adapting its program and responding to COVID-19? How are we adapting and responding to the lockdowns, restrictions on travel, and the emerging global food crisis? Our first response has been to work closely with our member churches and their partners to ensure that existing emergency food assistance programs are able to continue providing food for households that were already in an emergency situation before the pandemic. We see these programs as essential service that must be maintained through the crisis. Local partners have been quickly adapting how they are managing these food assistance programs to protect beneficiaries and staff, while also working within the parameters being established by national and local health authorities. We have authorized funding for the purchase of personal protective equipment and hygiene supplies, and have shared guidance on how to safely manage food distributions in the context of COVID-19. Partners and aid agencies have also been communicating with government authorities to get the necessary exemptions to continue this life-saving work. Partners have made the adjustments and obtained the exemptions needed to continue providing essential food to thousands of households in many countries around the world. At the same time, we are continuing to receive and approve project proposals for continued and new food assistance programs. In the first 2 weeks of April, we approved over $10 million of programming in Syria, and Lebanon, and South Sudan. And more programs will be approved in the coming weeks. This food assistance program is more vital than ever. Now, what about our long-term development programs? Many long-term development programs have been disrupted. Gatherings of large people for trainings is often not permitted now. Field visits and surveys at the household level are restricted. Some partner offices have closed and staff need to work from home. This has meant that some of these development project activities have been delayed or suspended. At the same time, where possible, project staff are connecting with community volunteers, project participants by telephone. And many of our projects work through trained lead farmers or key volunteers in the community. And these people are still able to connect with their neighbors and the community members to continue the work in these communities. In the short term, we're continuing to pay the salaries of project staff so that when the projects are able to continue once restrictions have been lifted. It'll be important that local partners are well positioned to work with communities in the recovery process and to help sustain and build on the long-term development gains that have already been made. We're also encouraging partners to continue planning for new programs, particularly agricultural programs, so that we can get new programs up and running after partners are able to fully operate again. It will be important to continue strengthening food production and agriculture and other livelihoods following the major disruptions to local economies that has happened. So how are we funding these responses? We're grateful for the banking model that we have, whereby supporters have deposited funds into the bank, which we are then able to draw down in response to crisis as they emerge. We have funds in the bank that are growing projects and donors deposited over the fall and winter months, in which we are now using. We also continue to have our government matching funding available. However, we will need to replenish this funding if we are to continue programming in response to the emerging food crisis and beyond. We recognize that many supporters, many of you are facing your own loss of income or dealing with the immediate needs in your own communities. We are all genuinely in this crisis together. We are hopeful that most growing projects across the country will be able to plant a crop again this year. And we also remain hopeful that as Canadians become aware of the emerging global food crisis, those that are able to will continue to provide support to our program. In addition to funding overseas programs, we continue to engage with our government in our response to the global health and food needs. We have been in conversation with the Minister of International Cooperation, Karina Gold, and officials at Global Affairs Canada about this emerging global food crisis. While the federal government is rightly focused on the health and economic crisis in Canada, we have been encouraging them to also remain engaged internationally and are supportive of their initiatives in this regard. We've been urging the government to help protect global food supply chains and to support the effective and timely delivery of food assistance to households in desperate need. The uncontrolled spread of the virus in other countries, collapsing economies, and extreme hunger is not something we want to see. And it's also not in Canada's interest. As this pandemic has shown, we're all deeply connected. It is important that our government hear that Canadians want them to remain engaged internationally, that we are part of a global community that needs to work together. I want to thank you for taking time to join us on this webinar and look forward to your questions. Back to you, Musu. You're on mute, Musu.
Yeah. And thank you. Just a reminder to everybody and everybody who's tuning in today to use the question and answer box to send in your questions that might have come to mind as Jim was speaking. We want to hear from two different people who are living through COVID-19, this coronavirus pandemic, in very different contexts than we are right now. And it's important for us to get that perspective. Our first guest panelist is Nadia Curry. And Nadia is the executive director of an organization called Tahadi, which translates to challenge. This nonprofit is located in a densely populated informal settlement in Lebanon, provides education, health, and social services to families facing hardship, refugee families. And through her work, she works alongside World Renew, one of the Foodgrains Bank members, and helps Syrian refugees access food. Nadia completed graduate studies in public health at Boston University and more recently, the UN-sponsored master's degree in refugee psychosocial support and dialogue. She has been involved in community work for nearly 20 years and is passionate about exploring ways to rethink our response to migration, especially as it intersects with urban poverty. Nadia, over to you.
Many thanks, Muzo, for that introduction and for all of you for allowing me to participate and join you today. I wanted just to take a few minutes to show you my corner of the world here in Beirut. So as was shared, we are a grassroots organization working very much at the community level. We work in one of the most densely populated neighborhoods of Beirut. It's home to hundreds of families living very closely. It's a diverse neighborhood. We have many Lebanese families as well as families who have been forced to seek refuge from Syria. And what brings them together is really looking for affordable housing, a way for them to raise their family, make an income, and make it through the next day. I wanted to now take you on a short walk through the neighborhood, show you what it's like inside this neighborhood, and then share with you a bit about how this neighborhood has been affected by the COVID crisis in the context of already a very difficult season in the history of our country with an ongoing political and economic crisis. So the following slide will share a little bit of the view as we walk through the neighborhood. What is it like for families living there? Families live very closely. We have usually 5 to 8 people in a room. Neighbors are closely packed together. So you can imagine what this means with an infectious disease. And as Jim was talking earlier, the crisis is not only a health crisis, but very, very much one of an economic crisis that quickly translates into a food crisis. It was, as Jim described, within the first few days, we sensed a deep panic among the community. People did not know where their next meal would come from. We were very overwhelmed the first few days in trying to respond to those needs. But thanks to the long partnership we've had with the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, we were able to quickly react on various fronts. Within a few days, we were able to ensure that over 500 families had access to essential food to make it through the lockdown. The lockdown in Beirut started in the beginning of March. And unfortunately, because of the multiple crises we're going through, the government was not able to quickly respond. Beirut and Lebanon as a whole has been going through an economic crisis that started in the mid of last year, which has seen a rapid rise in unemployment. The figures just from between October to December of 2019 showed that over 220,000 people had lost their jobs. We estimate that 40% of the population is now living in poverty, and that is growing rapidly. 20% of them are in extreme poverty. And we've seen a huge rise in the cost of food. The difference in the cost of food between October 2019 until February is nearly a 40% increase due to the inflation. And so for very, very poor families, this is catastrophic. Add to that the COVID crisis, which has brought around a lockdown. And so people working in the informal sector, working as day laborers, are not able to make ends meet. And that's why vital programming through the Canadian Foodgrains Bank and other organizations is critical at this point. And we have seen the huge difference that it's made. I'm sharing a few pictures of some of the families receiving the aid on the left, as well as some of the other programs that we're doing. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of a quick and rapid response to this growing food crisis. I just want to share a little bit as I end here, as not to go on too long, of one story of a family that's very close to our hearts. And you'll get to see him in the next slide. His name is Sammy. We got to know him. He was working in the neighborhood, and unfortunately, his father had an injury, an occupational injury, and was not able to work anymore. So Sammy had to work to provide for the family, and was working in a hair salon. And as we got to know him, he quickly expressed that he would rather go back to school. And so in talking to the family, we understood that this was very much an economic issue, very much one related to basic survival, to putting food on the table. And so in working with the family, ensuring that we could give a food voucher as sponsored by the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, we were able to ensure that he was removed from employment and back in school. And he's been actively in our education center for many months now. And so Sammy and his family are also now on this program that we started with the COVID crisis to ensure that they don't slip further into poverty, and the gains made in those last 2 months are not lost. But the situation on the ground is very dire. Families can't last more than a few more weeks like this. And so I can only reiterate what was said earlier by Jim about how urgent it is to respond. And I really would like to also say how touching it is for us to see this connection between Canada and our seemingly small corner of the world, and how people geographically far care so much for these families. So really a deep thank you from all of us on the grounds. Thank you for continuing to care for these families and to see how quickly their lives are impacted from this lockdown, and how time is short to respond. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Appreciate getting that picture of what life is like under COVID-19 in your corner. As small as it is, it's an important part for everybody. So before we head on to Lillian, I just wanted to acknowledge that we have a question that I think I just want to read out and to let you know that we will have a response later on. The question is, with the long term in mind, as governments focus and spend incredible amounts of dollars within their own country, what do we do to keep the focus on the millions that go hungry every day? And just to let you know that towards the end of the program, we will have ideas for you of how to respond to what you're hearing today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Lilian Zheke. Lillian lives in Harare, Zimbabwe, where she serves as the Foodgrains Bank Agriculture and Livelihoods Technical Advisor for Southern Africa. She's part of a technical support team for the Foodgrains Bank and for Tier Fund UK, focused on agriculture and livelihoods programs in sub-Saharan Africa. Her priority countries include Zimbabwe and Malawi, but she also supports programming in Zambia, Mozambique, and Uganda. Lillian has experience working in both government extension, agricultural extension work, and the non-governmental sector. And in addition to basic agricultural training, she brings strong skills in agricultural marketing, meteorology, and some experience with livestock promotion. Thank you so much for joining us, Lillian, and over to you now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I live in Zimbabwe, but I work with partners across Southern Africa, as you have heard, primarily focusing on agriculture and livelihoods. In terms of the Zimbabwe situation, to date, we have had 28 infections and 4 deaths. This is our 24th day on lockdown after the government extended the lockdown last Sunday by 2 weeks. To allow them to put in place additional measures in the fight against COVID-19. In terms of the impact on the ground, we've seen an increase in the number of people requiring food assistance. Even before the advent of COVID-19, Zimbabwe was already food insecure after experiencing a drought year, as well as due to other macroeconomic challenges that we face as a country. And the fact that 60% of our population is employed by the informal sector has actually meant that some people are not able to go out to do their work they would normally do. They are forced to stay at home, but at the same time, they cannot provide for their families. So we've actually seen the number of people in need of food actually increasing. And generally, we've also seen an increase in prices of basic commodities, owing to the fact that we are a net importer and our borders have been closed, and also as a result of macroeconomic challenges that I have alluded to, especially the hyperinflation in the country. In terms of supplies, these have been disrupted. Just to mention that during the first week of the lockdown, there were long queues for maize meal. Maize meal is very important in the Zimbabwean diet because our staple food is sadza, which we prepare from maize meal. So in spite of the lockdown, people risked to go out and queue for maize meal because of the shortages. And there were also some social distancing issues, which I want to believe is a problem in the whole of Africa. We also saw some of our farmers losing their produce as this was confiscated around roadblocks, especially the horticultural farmers. But access to markets is generally improved because some of the restrictions have been relaxed by government after seeing the impact it was having on farmers, as well as the general population. In terms of our work, we are working from home. All the partners are working from home in the countries that I'm looking after. And in terms of food activities, we've had to postpone, particularly trainings, monitoring, other visits that we normally make to try to assist farmers as they improve, as they produce, to assist them to improve their productivity. So although we are still able to communicate virtually, contact with farmers has been reduced. Also, as a result of COVID-19, we've seen a decrease in supply of vet drugs as well as inputs due to the disruptions in the supply system. In terms of what this all means or where it's going, we are not sure, and we are not even sure what is going to happen once the lockdown is lifted. But what is clear is that there is urgent need to provide food assistance beyond the 5 million that were food insecure before the advent of COVID-19. We also need to continue to support production, especially the farmers, so that we can ensure that food supply is not affected. Just as I end, I would like to kindly request that we remember Zimbabwe in our prayers, particularly the health sector, as they have to operate under very difficult conditions. Our health system is under-resourced. We also need to remember those who are under lockdown but do not enough to go through the day, so that God can make it possible for them to be catered for, as well as our governments as they try to steer us through the situation that we are having. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Lillian. We will definitely include Zimbabwe in our prayers going forward. Thank you for painting that picture for us. It's definitely one that is difficult and that many people around the world can relate to at this time. Now we have some time to respond to some of the questions that have been coming in. We have a question that I'm going to pass along to Jim on Central America.
I think the question is, to what extent, how is this affecting rural communities in Central America? And I can't speak really specifically to the to particular communities in Central America, but what I would say from what I'm reading and hearing from folks is that in the immediate terms, rural communities are actually slightly better off than some of the urban communities because they're often farming communities and have some stocks often in their households from past production that can carry them through for a while. And it's the most immediate impact is often with the very poor in urban centers. However, we're quickly beginning to see that the knock-on effects into rural communities will begin to happen. What's happening is Many families are sending people home, are sending people from urban areas back to the villages, suddenly having a lot more mouths to feed back in the villages. And for many of the villagers, they also depend on labor activities and other sort of activities in their community. To the extent that those start to get shut down and markets get disrupted in those rural communities, you'll start to see hunger growing also in the rural communities. It'll probably be a little later than what's going on in the urban centers, but we are hearing increasing reports of sort of these disruptions and more people in the households in rural communities and declining food supplies.
We have a question from Margaret Thomas that asks, does any Canadian Foodgrains Bank money help people in Canada who are close to the edge for hunger? And I'll take that question if you don't mind, Jim. For us, the Canadian Foodgrains Bank has been given a mandate by our members. We are a partnership of 15 churches and church-based agencies here in Canada, all of whom are involved in meeting the needs of people who find themselves on the edge here in Canada. One of our members is Salvation Army, a well-known national organization serving the poor here in Canada and those who are on the edge. All of the churches, we have the Anglican Church of Canada, the Catholic Church, the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, Canadian Baptist Ministries, and on and on. And they're all involved in serving the needs of Canadians. And they have given the mandate of the the Foodgrains Bank has been given the mandate by those members to serve the needs of those abroad who are facing hunger at this time. And so our organization actually represents a very practical manifestation of the idea that we're all in this together, that those churches through the Foodgrains Bank are reaching out to the world at the same time as they are reaching out domestically. We have a question here. I'm going to ask Lillian if she can answer it live. What are your thoughts on reducing the impact of the increasing spread of the locusts?
Oh, okay. So there is need to reduce the impact of locusts, and currently the most affected areas are in East Africa, but there is a probability that it's going to move southwards. But of concern, as I was chatting to some of the partners yesterday, that focus seems to have shifted for now, as governments and everyone is focusing on fighting COVID-19. Yet the impact of the locusts is very real. So there is need for us to make a concerted effort to fight the locusts. But now in terms of priorities, there seem to be a mismatch somehow.
Thank you, Lillian. Jim, in terms of food aid, where it is sourced and where there's shortage, is there any consideration being given to shipping food direct from Canada to countries in need to add to the pool of what types of food might be available for people?
At this point, we're not considering shipping directly from Canada, mainly because that would take 3 to 4 months to get food there because of the long time it would take to sort of both procure and ship. What we are working at more is there is food available at this point in many of the countries we're operating, but we're strongly working with Canadian government and with other groups to try and make sure that the food supply systems into these countries don't get disrupted, that they're allowed to continue to import food so that there's food in the markets. And then our job is to then make sure that those that don't have the money to buy that food that's there in the markets, we're helping them with either cash to buy the food, vouchers, or in fact, directly providing food to them. But at this point, we think the best way is to try and make sure and work with governments, make sure that food supply systems are working, that food is coming into the countries as they're needed, and that we then focus on getting that food out to households in need.
I'm muted. Yes, I saw that. Jim, just to follow up a question, a couple of people have asked the question that comes very often to the Foodgrains Bank. How do you avoid, somebody's asking because they disagree with this, but they hear this a lot. How do you avoid having the aid fall into the hands of corrupt government? That's a question that comes regularly, and just how would you answer that?
Well, in terms of our program, we work with partners on the ground, trusted partners, such as the one that Nadia is the executive director of. And so these are partners that have been vetted and work closely with our member churches, many of them over many years. And so the food that we're providing, or the cash or whatever, is delivered and distributed through this network of partners around the world that are proven to be able to get food to those really in need. We have regular systems for monitoring this with these organizations, and have confidence that the vast majority of the aid we provide gets to the people that desperately need it.
Okay. Thank you. No, I'm not muted. Nadia, do you have any follow-up to that from a local perspective as a local trusted partner?
What I would say to that is that really, I think that the mechanism that is in place in working through the churches is very efficient. And then the churches working either directly with the community or through community organizations such as us. Community organizations tend to be very lean and also very close to the needs. So we're able to respond quickly with very little cost to delivering the food. We also have close relationships with the families on the ground, and are able to identify those that really need that food or that assistance, be it cash or vouchers. And so I think this network of global relationships is what allows the response to be both efficient and fast.
A couple of people have asked the question again about how do we help keep the focus on some of the international needs, given some of the money that's being spent in Canada right now. And to respond to that, we are really encouraging Canadians to let their government officials know, their members of parliaments know, that they support a compassionate and generous Canada at this time, with the understanding that this is a global issue that needs a global solutions, that even as we rightly look to alleviate the difficulties for Canadians here at home, that we also need to be working with multilateral groups, with international groups, in order to alleviate the effects of COVID-19 on people around the world. So let your member of parliament know that you support a compassionate and generous Canada, either through writing of letters or through the use of social media messages, which are very effective for spreading the word at a time like this. So that's from David Nobert and James Noble have both asked that. And so at the end, we'll have some more information about you on that, for you on that. We have a question about the impact of the current flooding issues in Kenya. Lillian, do you have any insight for us on that?
Okay, what I know is that there are indeed some floods that have been experienced in Kenya, which have led mostly to landslides. From the report that I had with one of the partners, they were indicating that this is very serious and is worsened people that already were suffering as a result of the COVID situation and as a result of the lockdown, now under threat from the floods as well.
Okay, thank you. Nadia, there's a question here for you. Is the refugee population in rural Lebanon doing better or worse than the city refugee population?
It's comparing two very, very difficult situations. I think they're both in very dire need. The ones in urban areas perhaps are less supported, in the sense that they're left to really figure out things on their own, try to find an income in any way they can, informally, working as day laborers. So with the combined crisis of the economic downturn in Lebanon, which means there's basically no jobs for anyone, combined with a lockdown where you're not allowed to move even if you had a job, makes it very difficult for the urban refugee. At the same time, the ones in rural areas are dependent either on agriculture, and so might be initially a little bit better, but with the lockdown, they might not be able to get to their fields. There's also really efforts to contain any spread. And so oftentimes the tented communities, as they're called here, where refugees live, are not able to move around. So they're not able to get to their workplace, or they're not able to really even to purchase food if they need to. And so in those circumstances, food is often brought into them. So I would say both of them have their unique challenges, and both are in very difficult situations.
Thank you. Jim, I have an interesting question here that's sort of big picture. Do you think that developing world governments might need to turn to food rationing in order to stave off hunger and starvation? What would be your opinion on that? You're muted.
Thank you. Am I unmuted now? Putting in place a rationing system is a very complex process, and it's unlikely to be put in place by very many governments, just because of how complex it is to manage. I think much better for government to be working at making sure that the supply systems, food supply chains are functioning. As Lillian mentioned a little earlier, in Zimbabwe, they'd initially put some constraints on food moving within the country. They realized the problems that was going to create it, so they're lifting those constraints. So we are really talking to governments about much more keeping these supply systems functioning. And then the next thing is for governments to do is to get basically money into the hands of people to be able to buy the food that they need as quickly as possible. And so I think those are the two priority areas for governments, rather than moving to a rationing system, which I think would be extremely difficult to implement and unlikely to happen in most countries.
It looks like we have a question. Oops. It looks like we have a question from a partner who's asking, how do partners, Canadian Foodgrains Bank partners overseas, access the personal protective equipment to support those that are still active and doing the food distributions and programs?
We have simply been authorizing partners to purchase some of this equipment from supplies that they are able to access in their country. We don't have supplies that we could provide from here. I don't know the specifics around the supplies in every country that we're working. So it's really up to the partners to be identifying where those supplies might be available in their country. And then we have been authorizing them to use some of the budgets they have to source those supplies. So that's about as much as I can say at this point.
Thank you very much. We have John from the Conservation Agricultural Program in Kenya, who will be typing up an answer of some more information for us in the chat box on the situation in Kenya right now to help answer that question that came in. So I am going to say that this brings us to a close, and to thank you so much for joining us in this live event. And it's just been so very exciting for us to be able to do this. Like many of you, this is a new experience for us. But I'd like to close off with, first of all, a very special thank you to Jim, to Lillian, and for Nadia for being here with us. And especially to Lillian and Nadia for staying up extra late to be part of this live event. We are really all in this together. And we want to thank you for your support that keeps people around the world, keeping people around your world in your prayers, especially during this time. And we have 4 ways that we ask you to continue to be involved and to respond to the information that you've heard here today. First of all, we ask that you give. We have a question about whether we need additional donations. As you heard Jim say at the top, we need to replenish the funds in the bank as we make these commitments. We've made $10 million worth of commitments to deliver food programming around the world in April. And we need to raise at least $2 million between now and the end of August in order to replenish the funds for those kinds of programs. We ask that you pray. You can visit our website at foodgrainsbank.ca/coronavirus for prayers. We know it's very difficult at this time sometimes to even know how to pray. We're all in this and finding it difficult to actually think about what's going on. And so we have prayers there for you. So you give, pray, and learn. Go to trusted sources, and including this Foodgrains Bank landing page that we've created with resources. Many of you are stuck at home with children and are homeschooling. We have educational resources that you can use to bring these food security issues, especially in light of coronavirus, home to your children. We have activities for all ages there. And last but not least, we ask that you advocate. And so this goes to that question that was being asked. How do we keep this issue in front of our government? Please take time to write to your MP. We can do a harvest of letters. You can find that also by going to our website. You can put messages on social media through Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and tag your MP and let them know that you are in support of a compassionate and generous Canada, and that you understand that we're all in this together, and that you support their efforts to help out internationally, even as we continue to support each other here at home. So thank you. That brings us to the end. I hope that we will continue to have this dialogue. You'll be able to ask questions on Facebook or put comments there. And please feel free to email us, cfgb@foodgrainsbank.ca, with any further questions or comments that you might have. Jim, I'll just ask you to end for us then.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I hope you've learned some things about what the situation is around the world and are inspired to take action in the ways that you are able. We do know that many of our supporters, many Canadians, are facing very difficult times themselves at this point, and some are simply trying to figure out how to manage their own lives and have lost jobs and employment, and we understand that. But for those that are able to offer some support, we would really appreciate it, because the needs are growing around the world, and we really see ourselves as a vehicle for Canadians to also reach out to the neighbor across the ocean, as well as the ones that they're reaching out to down the street or in their own cities. So thank you very much for taking the time, and continue to reach out if you want to. We're happy to answer questions and respond, and so don't hesitate to send emails or make a phone call, and we'll get back to you. Thank you.